should point out I feel a little bit silly talking about whether or not we should revisit the relationship of Eskimo and Aleut together, given how much evidence there is for that relationship compared to Dene-Yenisieian. But nevertheless, I wanted to do that as a result of some work that I've been doing over the past 5 or 6 years, looking into archaeology, genetics, and Eskimo-Aleut. And I should also preface this by saying that I'm very much a debutante when it comes to archaeology and genetics, so please bear with me. Ooh, how did that get?
You worked at full, you haven't tried. Try.
90 degrees.
Yeah, no, it's switched 90 degrees from, oh well. This is the Aleutian chain, the Pribilof and the Commander Islands. I'll skip over that. A view of St. Paul, the Pribilof Islands, and some of the speakers that I've worked with, along with my young daughter, even younger at the time. So our current understanding of the relationship between Eskimo and Aleut is that we have known for at least 200 years that there is definitely a relationship between the two. And this comes on with 200 years of solid comparative work on this. Eskimo and Aleut are thought to have split about 4,500 years ago, give or take a little bit, and also that Aleut is very different from Eskimo. The biggest enigma seems to be the divergent lexicon, so about anywhere from 75 to 85% of the lexicon is noncognate. Syntactic differences have been explained as largely due to internal changes. So Berge makes this comment: there is no evidence for any foreign substratum in Aleut that could account for the differences from Eskimo. The differences must be regarded as the outcome of normal dialectal innovations. Although several scholars have taken a different point of view. So Jeff Leer wrote about the possibility of a northwest coast, including Aleut area, Sprachbund, sort of a speech community with shared features. And Fortescue, 1998, believes in a substrate theory and makes a point of a lot of comparison, a lot of comparable syntactic, morphosyntactic features between Athabascan and Aleut. So what I want to raise today is what exactly is the nature of the relationship between Eskimo and Aleut? What assumptions have we made about their relationship? And what might be some of the problems that are hidden within these assumptions? How do we explain the divergent nature of Aleut, and what role might language contact have played? So I don't, by the way, try to dispute these assumptions. I'm just merely pointing out that they need to be recognized as assumptions. And the first one is that there are sufficient similarities and correspondences between the Eskimo and Aleut languages to reconstruct a common proto-language. Again, as I mentioned before, we've seen some very solid comparative work from as early as 1819 to as late as 2010 and probably later, with many regular sound correspondences and grammatical similarities, which have been demonstrated. So here, I don't know if you can see these, but in terms of phonology, the language groups have similar phonologies, phonotactics, syllable structure. Differences are largely explainable. In terms of the morphology, both language groups tend to be polysynthetic, exclusively suffixing. Eskimo has a single prefix ta, and there may be traces of this in Aleut. Most grammatical morphemes are comparable, so we have the same sets of relative and possessive suffixes, person, number suffixes, parallels between nominal verbal morphology, and many cognate derivational postspaces. In terms of the in terms of the syntax, there's a fundamentally similar mood system with a series of so-called independent moods and a series of so-called dependent moods, which I'll get back to in a second. Both language groups are clause chaining, meaning they have series of dependent clauses and a final independent clause. Semantics has been understudied in both groups of languages, but nevertheless we can see similarities in the semantics, traces of a number system based on 20 in Aleut. Ooh. I think I left something out there. Basically, a number system based on 20, which is definitely found in Eskimo, and some traces of them may be found in Aleut, but it's already obsolete by the early historical period. Both language groups have similar deictic systems. They have similar groups of words that require negation, for example, to know, and other things such as that. And in terms of the lexicon, I think what's missing here, I don't know why it's missing, is that 15 to 25% of the lexicon is seen as cognate. Where are we? Sorry. Okay. And the second assumption is that Aleut is largely the one that has innovated. This is an oversimplification. We all know that Eskimo has innovated too, but in terms of which one is more innovative, Aleut is generally considered more innovative. And there is clear evidence that Aleut has changed from a system that is originally closer to Eskimo. So, for example, Berge makes a strong case that Aleut originally had an ergative absolutive system, a transitive inflectional system, and that language internal changes or innovations in Aleut brought about the following changes. So, for example, just the simple loss of case endings would have brought about something on the order, along the lines of fixed word order, the use of positional nouns or postpositions. So I have here, instead of the Inuit ihlumi, in the house, we have ulam ilan, in the house is inside, which is today equivalent to in the house. Both of those constructions are possible in Eskimo languages. Only the first is possible in today's Aleut. Anaphoric case marking, which is a very different kind of case marking. And I'm not going to go into it because other people have gone into it far more in detail. And then also the reanalysis of a uvular ending on nouns as the current absolutive case. The deictic system is obviously related to Eskimo and Aleut, has most probably innovated. And I've recently been looking at this and figured that it makes more sense to say that Aleut has innovated than that Yupik or other Eskimo languages have innovated. Aleut has over 50 positional nouns, otherwise known as postpositions. Berge identifies 7 as cognates with Eskimo, although this should be CED, sorry. Comparative Eskimo Dictionary identifies another 13 or so. And very likely Aleut innovated here because it has extended the system to use many nouns with actually full semantic content. And not only that, but it has also extended them to metaphorical uses and very possibly to stylistic or narrative language. Oh dear. Okay, I don't know if you can see this. I got greedy. So, but despite all of this, there are some problems that need to be addressed and that we've tended to gloss over. A number of the reconstructions are very speculative and problematic. And in fact, many of the sound correspondences themselves have not all been established satisfactorily. So, for example, here's a quote from Bergsland, 1986. After an A, U, or I in the first syllable, the schwa of the second syllable is reflected in Aleut as 0, I, U, or A, which are in fact the only vowels possible in Aleut. So you're not really saying very much there. And there are many other instances of this kind of thing. Bergsland was an extremely careful scholar, and he was very careful about what he said. He did not make claims that he couldn't substantiate. So the point is that we have to go back and maybe look at the comparative possibilities a little more in depth and try to explain some of these sound correspondences. he also posits a number, he and others posit a number of possible sound course of cognates, which have not been established as true cognates. And I'm not a lexicologist, but when Jim asked me to refine what I was going to talk about, because I was going to talk more about syntax, he suggested I couldn't leave out a discussion of the lexical items. So I actually went in and decided on what basis have we decided that things are cognates. I'm not talking about the sound correspondences. At this point, I just wanted to see, okay, how does it play out? How do we decide that Eskimo and Aleut really are related based on these things? And I found some interesting little tidbits here. If you look at the actual proposed cognates, we have a number of body parts, but they are not the most obvious body parts. Vertebrae of the loin, anus, nape of the neck, muscle. We have about 12 or 13 terms for nature, but only about 4 of them are the really basic ones. We have lots of terms for material culture, but all of those terms are really about the male activities. So female activities, berry gathering, basket making, needles and sewing are not represented in the cognates. In terms of clothing, there's only about, oh dear, half of this is cut off. In terms of I'm just going to have to do it by memory here. So in terms of clothing, only 5 terms, of which 3 are found in the Yupik, in the neighboring Yupik languages. Boot, mitten made of sealskin, walking stick, and piece of clothing. Can't remember what the 5th is. Very general terms. What's really interesting is the kinship terms, only 5 of them. And these are, again, not the most basic ones. I think one of the most basic is mother, and there's also husband, but all of the others are, one of them is same-sex sibling of either sex. And another one is one of the uncles, I think. I'm trying to remember here. So it's not obvious to me exactly what was maintained, what was maintained and what shifted in Aleut. Dear. Sorry about this. So if we look at the non-cognates now, there are lots of specific terms, body terms, flora, fauna, kinship, natural phenomenon, geography, and many of this we could expect simply because the different groups live in different geographical areas. If we just as a quick exercise, and I understand that Swadesh is not terribly popular and there are problems with it and so on, but as a basic starting point for looking at what's basic and what isn't, if we take a look at his 200-word list, there are twice as many non-cognates as good cognates, and many of these are the basic terms like blood, cloud, egg, fire, ice, lake, mountain, 2, 3, what, wife, there are about 10 derived forms, roots of which may very well be cognate. So the word for son, I think, is aradach. Ara is a root that has a cognate in Eskimo. And there are a number of entries that show semantic shift, but there are also many dubious cognates which require assumptions that we have not proven. So for example, Luda, meaning older, and Nuja requires the assumption that L in Aleut was some form of assimilation. It's not a direct correspondence. We have some questions that should come up with respect to the morphosyntax. The first few of these are actually fairly explainable. Aleut is actually nowhere near as polysynthetic as Eskimo. This is explainable as a post-split rise of Eskimo polysynthesis, so we shouldn't be too terribly concerned about this. The moods may be morphologically similar, but they function very differently. Again, potentially understandable or explainable as language independent and internal changes. But there are a few things that are very different, and this has been coming up more in some of the research that I've been doing on syntax. For example, there's a very distinct difference in preferences for valency changing devices and the extent of the use of passives in Aleut. So Aleut very much prefers anything that adds or decreases a subject and does almost nothing with objects, at least with valency changing. Whereas the opposite is true in Eskimo. Coordination strategies are actually quite different. The preferred method of coordination in Eskimo is with a clitic and also reduplication of the coordinator. And this is done very differently in Aleut. Coordination also has an effect on number agreement with the verb in Aleut, which it does not in Eskimo. So there are some fundamental syntactic differences here. Another very big one is the number marking and agreement patterns, where, Jeff Leer talked about this in his 1991 paper, but I've gone a little further with Pribilovian dialect. And what's very clear there is that there's a head marking of the plural suffix on nouns, and it can filter down to any level within a phrase. And this is not done in Eskimo. Eskimo is very canonical. There's nothing unusual about Eskimo number agreement patterns, whereas there are lots in Aleut. And the use of auxiliaries and other things. Okay. There are differences in semantics. One of them, for example, if we go back to the Aleut counting system and the traces of the vigesimal system, it worked nevertheless differently than it did in Eskimo. So Eskimo has a very clear number system based on 20, and the word for 20 is in fact not based on 10, whereas that never seems to have been the case in Aleut. There are also differences in culture as reflected in language. So the kinship system is apparently like Yupik. I don't know very much about the Yupik system, but I was able to glean that there are some similarities with Aleut, but very unlike Inuit. And it hints at a complex relationship with cross cousins as marriageable, parallel cousins are not, and the paternal aunt has a very special relationship. Naming conventions and practices, again, this is something that Bergsland mentioned about 15 years ago. So very different from Eskimo. The grandfather names the child, and it's based on important life experiences in the grandfather's time. There's no assumption of reincarnation, and it's phrasal rather than nominal names. So okay, so the questions. Are these differences a result of language internal change? What caused such extensive changes in Aleut? Why should Aleut change so much and Eskimo remain so relatively stable? And we think Eskimo has remained relatively stable for at least on the order of 2,000 years if you go back to Yupik and Inuit. So why would Aleut change so much? And I should point out, although there's extensive Aleut influence on Yupik, most of that is in the form of loanwords, not in the form of the grammar. Most of the changes noted here could be seen as the result of language internal changes. And certainly some fairly simple internal changes can precipitate massive changes in an entire system. And we've seen that in the history of English, for example, like the English case endings in fixed word order, or as in the Great Vowel Shift. But nevertheless, the differences that I list here suggest a massive amount of change, not all of which I think can be attributed to a single trigger. And if we should take archaeology as any evidence, this is in a language with long-term cultural continuity. So what I want to suggest, and I'm not the first one to suggest this, but could these changes instead have been the result of language contact, and what degree of language contact? Again, Leer and Fortescue have both talked about language contact of some type. Leer prefers the idea of aerial contact, whereas Fortescue actually posits a language shift of one indigenous population to an incoming Eskimo-Aleut population. And he suggests that there is a certain amount of Athabascan-like influence on Aleut in the form of the auxiliary verbs, number marking on verbs, naming practices, and more. But I think we have to start with the basic questions that present themselves. So what degree of contact are we looking at? Are we looking at large-scale borrowing? I think we can go beyond that. Are we looking at a Sprachbund effect? Very possibly. Are we looking at language mixing? I have to say this is where I'm more and more coming to see this as, but that's very tentative at this point. Are we looking at language creolization? Personally, I don't think so, but we have to look at the possibility. Let's review what we've seen so far. We have many verbs. Oh, that was one thing I forgot to say in the core lexicon. Of the miscellaneous groups in the lexicon, the vast majority of those are verbs and grammatical morphemes. Okay, so we have many more verbs that are cognates. We have some core vocabulary. We have most of the grammatical morphemes that appear to come from Proto-Eskimo or Proto-Eskimo-Aleut. And most of the vocabulary and some complex grammar probably comes from something else. And I point you to the Dene-Aleut, the Copper Island Aleut example, which is a mixed language today. Now, obviously, what I'm saying, I do not in any way want to suggest that this is a mixed language. I'm just suggesting it's a possibility that we might need to look into. Because certainly some of the features of mixed languages are there. What scenarios can we posit? Did Proto-Eskimo-Aleut split and then Proto-Aleut develop as a result of a strong substrate influence? And if so, what substrate? This is the scenario favored by most linguists. Okay, this is the typical scenario that's given. I think there are other scenarios that we can actually look at too. Did Proto-Eskimo and Proto-Aleut merge at some point, leading to language mixing? There seems to be some evidence from other fields. For example, the Arctic small tools tradition in the Aleut area is very minimal as far as I know. Also, I think I have this somewhere else on a different slide, in terms of material culture, the time of closest contact between the Eskimos and the Aleuts appears to have been after the posited linguistic split. Did Eskimo influence Aleut such that Aleut is a substrate? And there are several periods of Eskimo incursion into the eastern Aleut areas that might support this. I don't know. Or maybe it's several or all of the above. That there was a Proto-Eskimo-Aleut layer very early on with subsequent waves of Eskimo influence, plus a possible substrate. I don't know where I am. Is this 5 minutes plus questions or not?
Well, including questions.
Ooh, okay, all right, very quickly, I'm almost done. Okay, so this is what I just said here, and, okay, never mind, we can skip that one. Was the change rapid or slow, and what groups are we talking about? Is Aleut a Proto-Eskimo-Aleut group? Is it an amalgamation of several groups? The genetic studies so far have been inconclusive, but actually suggest a closer relationship between Central Siberian Yupik and Aleut than between Alaskan Yupik and Aleut, possible Athabascan, Northwest Coast, and even 1 or 2 elements of Dorset in terms of genetics. But so far, every paper that I've read seems to contradict the other paper. So. Again, I want to stress that I'm not suggesting that Proto-Eskimo and Proto-Aleut do not reconstruct a Proto-Eskimo-Aleut, but merely that the picture is probably much more complicated than we have generally assumed. And I want to question what it takes to finally motivate us to say that we have one Proto-Eskimo-Aleut language to reconstruct to. The nature of the differences between Eskimo and Aleut together with new archaeological and possibly genetic evidence suggests that we need to reopen this discussion. There's very probably non-Eskimo-Aleut substrates or elements, I mean, in Aleut. And it would be what I've been wanting for a while now is to have a discussion with Athabascanists of different types of features that seem to be very different in Aleut and that may have sources elsewhere. And on one last note, the next paper is on phylogenetic studies, and 2 phylogenetic studies that I've seen of place Aleut sort of on par with Greek or on par with a South American language, not suggesting that those are related, but rather to show how different they are from Eskimo in these phylogenetic trees. So I think there's quite a bit more in detailed research that needs to be done on the history of Eskimo-Aleut.
Let's, we're going on to the coffee break, so we do have a little time. And I want to make the first comment. It is really an excellent paper. And this interior coastal dichotomy that Ben Potter was talking about in terms of archaeology should be brought into play with the Aleutians really being on the coastal migration corridor.
Don Dumont, as you may or may not know, posited a western Thule migration about 1,000 years ago with a major incursion into the region with an overlay of artifact types and so on. And there are certainly correlates in terms of big shifts in DNA, as well as, you know, the morphometrics of human skeletal remains in the Aleutians about that point in time. Let's assume that his model of Yupik speech being sort of superimposed on Aleut populations, maybe not just in that area, but maybe among Aleutic or Supiaq people as well around the same period of time, is the degree of cognates that you see, like a 15% level of cognates lexically, and you can talk about other things too, but is 1,000 years enough time to produce that level of cognates among widely separated languages? And how much difference would it make if originally they were Eskimo-Aleut that, you know, remained isolated for some thousands of years before that, say, 1000 AD? Migration took place, as opposed to being originally really different languages, maybe Aleut being more Athabascan-like or Northwest Coast-like in terms of its structure.
That's an excellent question, and I'm not sure how to answer that satisfactorily. I think we can see in that a language can change very rapidly, and especially if we're talking about mixing or creolization, which
and maybe even political imposition of more, say, powerful Yupik peoples on.
It's very possible, and also I should point out that a number of people, Woodbury, Fortescue, have pointed out just how similar Aleut, Krauss have pointed out how similar the Aleut dialects are to each other, and okay, we've just heard that Athabascan may be extremely conservative and may you know, be a very old language family with lots of similarities, but it's also true that the degree of similarity between the Aleut dialects suggests that they're relatively newly formed from each other. So there's also that element. So it may very well be that 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago is where we need to look. I don't know. And I pointed out in a previous slide when I asked when that it seems a little bit too shallow to explain the features in all the dialects of Aleut, but it is possible. So if you look at the proposed population crash that happened in the Aleutians and elsewhere around that time, and also the relative uniformity of the dialects, and the deictic system, which I've been looking at, which looks like it's relatively newly formed in Aleut. And by newly formed, I mean it's very obviously related to Eskimo. It's probably from Eskimo. But it innovated in very interesting ways. It took two groups of let's say the obscured, the thing that you can't see directly, or an extended, you know, a large item that spans more than your eye can necessarily see at once. Took two of those and threw them into different slots in Aleut, and it's much more explainable if you look at it from Aleut. And that's so regular. You know, deictic systems change all the time, and they're messy. And this is so regular that it suggests it's newer.
So maybe a sort of a split with a reimposition of Yupik speech at some later point in time makes the most sense. I guess my final question would be, are there other models in historic linguistics, I don't know that much about it, that involve similar kinds of things of an original language split in 1,000 for several thousand years, and then reimposition of speech by one of the daughters, sort of daughter products that can be used as a model for these.
You know, unfortunately, that's a great point, and unfortunately, at this point, I'm just at the beginning of